The boy helped his elderly neighbor prune the garden under the scorching sun, without expecting anything in return. The next day, when a limousine stopped in front of his house, he and his mother froze at the unexpected proposal. Liam kicked a stone along the sidewalk, his worn sneakers scraping against the cracked pavement as he walked through the neighborhood. The afternoon sun bore down, making his shirt stick to his back. The houses he passed looked like his own, small, faded. The gardens more weeds than flowers. He took a deep breath as he approached the place he called home, a modest one-story house with paint peeling off the door. Inside, his mother was folding laundry in the tiny living room, her eyes tired but brightening when she saw him. "Hey, sweetheart. How was school?" she asked, her hands still busy. "It was all right," Liam replied, dropping his backpack on the floor. He moved to the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water and chugging it down. The cold water felt good after the long walk. He heard his mother's sigh as she stacked the folded clothes into a neat pile. "Anything exciting happened today?" She tried again, her voice gentle but weary. Liam shook his head. "Nah, just the usual," he said, coming back into the room. He could see the bills on the table, some of them opened, others just a stack of unopened trouble. He knew better than to ask about them. Instead, he said, "I'm going to go see if Mrs. Holt needs help with anything." His mother gave him a small smile. "All right, just don't be out too late. Dinner's going to be, well, we'll see what it's going to be," she said, half laughing. "Yeah, I'll be back soon," Liam said, nodding. He stepped out again, the door creaking as it closed. He walked down the block, his eyes catching glimpses of old fences and overgrown yards. He did odd jobs around the neighborhood. The few dollars here and there made a difference, and people usually appreciated the help. Today, the heat was unforgiving, and Liam felt the sweat starting to bead on his forehead before he even reached Mrs. Holt's house. As he rounded the corner, he saw old Mr. Thompson out front, a pair of garden shears in hand. Mr. Thompson was hunched over, his back bending as he struggled to cut back the bushes that lined his property. The sweat stained his blue shirt dark, and he moved slowly, almost trembling. Liam paused, watching for a moment. Mr. Thompson looked up, wiping his brow, and spotted Liam. He smiled weakly. "Hot day, huh, Liam?" he said, his voice barely carrying over the distance. "Yeah, pretty bad," Liam replied, stepping off the sidewalk and onto Mr. Thompson's lawn. He glanced at the bushes. "Need a hand with that?" Mr. Thompson hesitated, then nodded. "If you don't mind, I've been at this for a while. These bushes have a mind of their own." Liam shrugged and took the shears from the old man's hand. They were heavier than they looked, and he felt the heat immediately, the sun directly overhead. He worked alongside Mr. Thompson, clipping back branches, feeling sweat running down his face and neck. It wasn't easy work, and the dry dirt kicked up around his feet as he stepped back to check his progress. "Thank you, son," Mr. Thompson said, breathing hard. He tried to help, using a small rake to pull the trimmings into a pile. Liam worked quietly, his mind focused on the task. He was tired from school, and every muscle ached, but Mr. Thompson looked like he might collapse if he kept pushing himself. After what felt like hours, but was probably just 30 minutes, they had made some progress. The bushes were trimmed and the front garden looked a little less chaotic. Mr. Thompson patted Liam on the shoulder, his hand shaky but firm. "You're a good kid, Liam," he said, his voice rough. "Come inside. Let me get you some lemonade." Liam hesitated. He thought about his mom at home, probably trying to figure out what to make for dinner, probably worrying about money. But Mr. Thompson's face was full of gratitude, and Liam couldn't bring himself to say no. "Sure, Mr. Thompson." "Just for a minute," Liam said. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and dust. Mr. Thompson led him to the kitchen and poured them both lemonade from a glass pitcher. Liam drank quickly, feeling the coolness spread through his body. Mr. Thompson sat across from him, His face relaxed for the first time since Liam had arrived. "You didn't have to help, you know," Mr. Thompson said, his eyes crinkling. "Not many kids would do that." "It's no big deal," Liam replied, shrugging. "Figured you could use the help." Mr. Thompson smiled. "Well, it's a big deal to me. You made my day a lot easier." Liam nodded, finishing his drink. He stood up, setting the glass on the counter. "I should get home. Mom's waiting for me," he said. Mr. Thompson struggled to his feet, following Liam to the door. "Take care, Liam, and thank you again." Liam waved and headed back out into the heat. The sun was starting to dip lower, but the air was still thick and hot. He felt his legs heavy as he walked, the weight of the day settling in. When he got home, his mom was sitting at the small table, her eyes on a letter she was holding. She looked up when Liam came in, quickly hiding the paper under the stack of other envelopes. "Everything all right?" Liam asked, noticing her quick movements. "Yeah, just bills," she said, forcing a smile. "How was Mrs. Holt?" "Didn't make it there. Helped Mr. Thompson instead. He was having trouble with his garden," Liam said, sitting down across from her. His mom nodded, reaching out to touch his hand. "You're a good boy, Liam. I hope you know that." Liam looked down at their hands, her skin rough from work, her fingers thin. "I just want to help," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, her voice soft. "I know you do." They sat there for a moment, the quiet filling the space between them. The world outside was still hot, still pressing down on everything, but in that small room, there was a kind of peace. Liam felt it, even as he saw the stack of bills and heard the worry in his mother's voice. He went to bed that night, the thoughts of the day swirling in his head. The old man's tired smile, his mother's hidden fears, the heat that never seemed to let up. He wanted to fix things, to make them better, but he didn't know how. He closed his eyes, hoping that somehow, tomorrow would be different. The next morning, Liam woke up to the sound of clattering dishes. He sat up in his small room, the light seeping through the thin curtains. He stretched, rubbed his eyes, and walked into the kitchen, where his mother was already busy. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice still groggy. "Morning, sweetheart," she replied, her back to him as she filled 2 cups with water. "Sorry if I woke you." "Nah, it's fine," Liam said, grabbing a slice of bread from the counter. He sat at the table, chewing slowly as he watched her. She seemed less tired today, which was a good sign, but he could still see the way her shoulders sagged a bit under the weight of everything. "I have to run a few errands today," she said, turning to face him. "Could you manage the house until I get back?" "Yeah, of course," Liam nodded. It wasn't unusual. She often went out in the morning, sometimes for work, sometimes just trying to stretch the money they had for groceries. Liam finished his bread and stood up, giving her a quick smile before heading outside. The air was already heating up, and Liam shielded his eyes as he walked down the street. His plan was to finally make it to Mrs. Holt's, but as he approached Mr. Thompson's house again, he slowed down. There, standing in front of the garden, was a man in a suit, someone Liam hadn't seen before. The man was staring at the freshly trimmed bushes, his hands in his pockets. He looked different from anyone in their neighborhood. The car parked in the driveway was too nice, too clean, and his suit looked out of place in this part of town. "Morning, son," the man said, noticing Liam. His voice was calm but commanding. He nodded towards the garden. "You do that?" Liam stopped, squinting at the man. "Yeah, I helped Mr. Thompson with it yesterday," he said slowly. The man looked at him for a moment, then smiled. "I'm his son, Martin Thompson. He's been having trouble with this garden for a while now. I appreciate you helping him out." Liam shrugged, shifting his weight. "He needed help," he said simply. "Figured it was the right thing to do." Martin kept his eyes on Liam, studying him. "Not many people would do that," he said. especially at your age." Liam didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded and looked away, unsure of why the man was making such a big deal out of it. Martin cleared his throat. "Do you live around here?" "Yeah, just down the street." Liam pointed vaguely in the direction of his house. Martin nodded, then turned back to the garden. "Well, I appreciate it, really. My father's been getting on in years, and I can't always be around to help him." Liam wasn't sure how to respond, so he just said, "It's no problem." He took a step back, ready to leave. "Hey, kid," Martin called, stopping him. "If you ever need anything, let me know. I don't come around often, but I'd like to help you out if I can." He handed Liam a card, the edges crisp, with Martin's name and number printed neatly. Liam took the card, confused. Thanks," he said, then quickly walked away, the card feeling strange in his hand. He slipped it into his pocket, not really thinking much of it. He had other things to worry about. As he walked towards Mrs. Holt's house, Liam found his thoughts drifting. The man's suit, his car, the way he looked at Liam, it was all so different from what he was used to. People around here didn't offer help. They didn't drive cars like that. They didn't hand out cards. He shook his head, trying to push it out of his mind. He had work to do. Later that day, Liam was sitting at home, helping his mother sort through some groceries she had managed to bring back. She looked tired again, and Liam watched her struggle with a heavy bag, her hands trembling as she lifted it to the counter. "Here, let me," Liam said, taking the bag from her. He could feel how light she'd become, her energy drained from the long days. She smiled at him, her eyes grateful. "Thanks, sweetheart." They worked in silence for a while, putting everything away in their cramped kitchen. The air felt heavy, the weight of their unspoken worries filling the small room. Liam reached into his pocket, feeling the crisp edge of Martin's card. He thought about the man, his polished shoes standing in the dust of Mr. Thompson's yard. "Mom," Liam said, breaking the silence, "I met Mr. Thompson's son today." His mother paused, looking up at him. "You did?" "Yeah, he was kind of strange. Gave me this card," Liam said, holding it out. She took it, reading it carefully. Her eyebrows went up a little, and she looked back at Liam. "Why did he give you this?" He said, "If we ever needed anything, I guess." Liam shrugged. "I think it was just because I helped Mr. Thompson with his garden." His mom stared at the card for a moment longer, then put it down on the table. "That's nice of him," she said, her voice neutral. "But we shouldn't expect anything, okay? People don't always mean what they say." Liam nodded. He understood. Promises like that usually came with strings attached. They couldn't afford to owe anyone anything. His mom had taught him that over and over. "Yeah, I know," Liam said. He picked up a box of cereal, putting it away on the highest shelf. Just thought it was weird. His mother gave him a tired smile. "Sometimes people are just trying to be kind. But we've got to take care of ourselves first, all right?" "All right," Liam said, and they went back to putting things away. It was later, as the sun began to set, that Liam heard the knock on the door. His mom looked up, her face instantly tense. They didn't get many visitors, and no one was expected. She moved to the door slowly, opening it just a crack. Outside stood Martin, his suit now slightly wrinkled as if he'd been out all day. Behind him, parked at the curb, was a long black limousine. Liam's mother opened the door a bit more, her eyes widening at the sight. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. Martin smiled. "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced. I'm Martin Thompson, Mr. Thompson's son." He looked past her, catching a glimpse of Liam standing in the kitchen. "I just wanted to speak with you both, if that's all right." Liam's mother turned back, her eyes meeting his. Liam stepped forward, his stomach nodding. "It's okay, Mom," he said quietly. She opened the door fully, stepping back to let Martin in. He nodded his thanks and walked into the small living room. He looked around as if taking in everything at once. "Sorry for the intrusion," Martin said, his tone polite but firm. "I wanted to thank you both, especially Liam, for helping my father yesterday. It meant a lot to him." Liam's mom gave a small nod, her face still cautious. "He's a good boy," she said, her hand resting on Liam's shoulder. Martin smiled, but then his expression shifted, becoming more serious. "I actually wanted to make an offer," he said, looking directly at Liam's mother. "I've been thinking about it, and I'd like to help. I know times are tough, and I have an opportunity that might make things easier for you." Liam's mother frowned slightly, her hand tightening on Liam's shoulder. "What kind of offer?" Martin glanced at Liam, then back at his mother. "I could use some help at my own home. It's a bit bigger, and I need someone reliable. If you'd be willing, I'd like to hire you as a domestic worker. It would pay well, much better than anything you'd find around here. You'd be able to start immediately." Liam's mother looked stunned. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her eyes wide. She turned to Liam, her expression a mix of confusion and hope. "What do you think, Mom?" Liam asked, his voice small. She swallowed, her eyes glistening. She nodded slowly. If it's really all right, then yes. I'd be happy to take the job." Martin smiled, his eyes softening. "It's settled then. I can take you now if you're ready. I know it's sudden, but there's no time like the present." Liam's mother looked at him, her hand brushing his cheek. "I'll be back later tonight, sweetheart. You'll be okay here?" Liam nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, I'll be fine." She gave him a quick hug, then turned to Martin. "Let's go." Martin nodded, leading her out. Liam stood in the doorway, watching as his mother climbed into the limousine. The door closed with a soft thud, and then the car rolled away, disappearing down the street. The house felt emptier as he turned back inside, the silence filling every corner. Liam took a deep breath, his eyes landing on the card still on the table. He picked it up and slipped it back into his pocket. Whatever came next, he would have to be ready. Liam woke up the next morning to an empty house. The quiet was different, more unsettling than the usual early morning peace. He rubbed his eyes, his gaze shifting to the small couch in the living room, where his mother usually sat when he woke up. It was empty. The weight of the previous night sank in as he remembered his mother leaving in that big limousine with Martin Thompson. The house felt too big without her, and even though he was used to taking care of things by himself, today felt different. He walked into the kitchen, grabbed some cereal and poured it into a bowl. He sat at the table, staring at the half-empty box, his spoon dangling from his hand. After breakfast, Liam washed the bowl, leaving it on the drying rack. He tried to focus on the things he had to do. He would help Mrs. Holt today, maybe do some errands to keep busy. But as he headed outside, he heard something unusual. The sound of a car engine, smooth, powerful, not the rickety old trucks he was used to hearing in his neighborhood. Liam stepped out of the house just in time to see a long, black limousine slowly pull up in front of their small driveway. His heart jumped, and he frowned. A limousine here meant only one thing. He took a step closer, his eyes wide, and saw the door open. His mother stepped out, her face lighting up when she saw Liam. The car door shut quietly behind her, and she waved to someone inside before the limousine began to drive away. "Mom," Liam called, his voice cracking slightly. She hurried toward him, smiling, but Liam could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, reaching him and pulling him into a quick hug. She smelled like someone else's perfume, and her clothes looked slightly wrinkled. "What happened?" Liam asked. "I thought you were... are you back now?" She shook her head, pulling back to look at him. "No, I'm not back for good. Martin's place is a lot of work, and it's going to be a full-time thing, at least for now. But he brought me back this morning so I could pack up some things, and I wanted to see you." Liam tried to smile, but it was hard. He wanted to be happy for her, but all he could think about was how empty the house had been, how empty it still felt. "Okay," he said quietly. His mother touched his cheek, her thumb brushing across his skin. "It's a good thing, Liam. The money will help us a lot. I'll be able to pay the bills and maybe we can get ahead, you know." He nodded, but the knot in his stomach didn't go away. She looked around the front yard, then smiled at him. "Come on, let's go inside for a bit. I need to pack." Liam followed her back into the house. She moved quickly, picking up a small bag and folding her clothes into it. She seemed energized, like the chance at this job had given her new hope. But to Liam, it all felt rushed, too sudden. He watched her, the pit in his stomach growing deeper. "Mom?" he asked, his voice quiet. She paused, looking up at him. "Yes, sweetheart." What if this doesn't work out?" he said, his words barely louder than a whisper. "What if it's too hard?" She walked over, kneeling in front of him so their eyes were level. "Liam, I know it's scary, I know it's new, but sometimes we have to take risks to make things better. This is our chance to make things better. You understand?" Liam bit his lip, then nodded. "Yeah, I understand." She hugged him tightly, her arms wrapped around him like she was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. "I promise, I'll be back whenever I can, okay? You're strong. I know you can handle things here." Liam held on to her for a moment longer before letting go. He watched as she finished packing, then followed her back outside. She looked at him, then at the house. "Take care of this place, all right?" she said, smiling. "I will," Liam said, his voice thick. She hugged him one last time, then turned and walked down the driveway. She waved to him as the limousine pulled back up, the driver opening the door for her. Liam stood there, watching as she climbed in, her eyes meeting his through the window. The car drove off, the engine almost silent as it moved away. He stood in the driveway for a long time, watching until the limousine disappeared around the corner. Then he turned back to the house, the silence rushing in like a wave. He walked slowly inside, shutting the door behind him, the click of the latch echoing through the empty space. The rest of the day felt like a blur. Liam tried to keep busy. He went to Mrs. Holt's and helped her move some boxes in her garage, earning a few dollars for his trouble. She gave him a sandwich for lunch, and he ate it in her kitchen while she talked about the weather and her grandkids. He nodded along, but his mind was somewhere else. When he finally returned home, the sun was starting to set. The shadows grew long across the street, the air cooling down after another hot day. He stepped inside, dropping his small bag of groceries on the counter. He stood there for a moment, looking around the kitchen, the emptiness of it all pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, trying to push away the feeling. He grabbed a dish towel and started wiping down the counter, just to have something to do. The silence filled every corner, and even though he tried to tell himself that everything was going to be all right, the weight of it all was too much. He missed his mom. He missed her voice, the way she was always there in the mornings, the way she smiled even when she was tired. He missed the way their tiny house felt when they were both in it. Now it just felt empty, like something had been taken away. Liam heard a knock on the door, pulling him out of his thoughts. He frowned, wiping his hands on the towel as he walked over. He opened the door, and there, standing in the fading light, was Mr. Thompson. "Evening, Liam," Mr. Thompson said, his voice raspy. He smiled, though it looked like he'd had a rough day. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," Liam replied, stepping aside. "What's going on?" Mr. Thompson walked in slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked around the small living room, then turned back to Liam. "I heard about your mom's new job," he said. "Saw the car this morning." Liam nodded. "Yeah, she's working for your son now." Mr. Thompson smiled gently. "Martin always was a good boy. He's trying to help, I think. Liam tried to smile back. Yeah, I know. It's just different. Mr. Thompson nodded, then looked at him, his eyes kind. You're a strong kid, Liam. I've seen that. Helping me yesterday, it meant a lot. I think you've got a good head on your shoulders. You'll be all right. Liam swallowed, his throat tight. Thanks, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson reached out, patting Liam's arm. If you need anything, you come see me, all right? I may not be able to do much, but I can help if you need it. Liam nodded, his eyes stinging. I will. Thanks. Mr. Thompson gave him a small smile, then turned, shuffling back toward the door. Liam opened it for him, watching as the old man made his way down the steps and slowly back across the yard. Take care, Liam, Mr. Thompson called back, raising his hand. You too, Liam replied, his voice cracking slightly. He closed the door, the silence rushing back in. He stood there for a moment, then walked over to the small couch. He sat down, his shoulders slumping, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up with him. He knew what he had to do. He had to keep going, keep doing what he could to make things better. For his mom, for himself, for everything they were trying to build. He leaned back, closing his eyes, trying to picture his mom's smile, trying to hold on to the hope she had brought with her that morning. Liam woke up to the silence again. The house was still and empty, a far cry from the mornings when his mother would hum softly while making tea or when she'd clatter dishes in the sink. He took a deep breath, rubbed his eyes, and got out of bed. The sun was barely up, but there was no point in lying there. There was work to do. He moved around the kitchen, picking up the few dishes that had been left out. He poured himself a small bowl of cereal, eating in silence. The cereal was stale, but it was all they had. He chewed slowly, staring at the wall, trying to think of everything he needed to do. After breakfast, Liam walked outside. The sun was climbing, the warmth already building in the morning air. He had a few houses to check in on, people who sometimes needed help with small tasks. But as he walked down the street, he realized his feet were taking him in a different direction. He ended up at Mr. Thompson's house again, staring at the front garden they'd worked on just a couple of days ago. It still looked neat, the bushes trimmed, the grass green. He stood there for a moment, unsure if he should knock. Just as he was about to turn away, the door creaked open. Liam? Mr. Thompson's voice called out. He was leaning on the doorframe, his eyes squinting against the sunlight. Morning, Mr. Thompson, Liam said, shoving his hands into his pockets. Just, thought I'd see if you needed anything today. Mr. Thompson smiled, his face wrinkling with the effort. I could use a bit of help if you're offering, he said, pushing himself away from the door. Come on in, son. Liam followed him inside. The house was dim and smelled like old wood and dust. Mr. Thompson moved slowly, each step deliberate as he led Liam to the back room. Got a few boxes I've been meaning to move, but these old bones aren't much help anymore, Mr. Thompson said, pointing to a pile of dusty boxes in the corner. Liam nodded, moving to grab the first box. No problem. Where do you want them? Mr. Thompson pointed towards a closet on the other side of the room. Just in there will do. Appreciate it, Liam. Liam started moving the boxes one by one. They weren't particularly heavy, but they were bulky, and the dust made his eyes water. Mr. Thompson watched him work, leaning on his cane, his breathing a little labored. You know, Mr. Thompson said after a moment, it's a good thing you're doing here, helping folks out. Not many kids your age would bother. Liam shrugged, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. It's just, what needs to be done. Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. Your mother raised you right, that's for sure. Liam didn't respond. He just kept working, focusing on getting the boxes into the closet. He didn't want to think about his mother right now, about how she wasn't here, about how different everything felt without her. When the boxes were all moved, Mr. Thompson smiled, his eyes soft. "That's good enough for today, son. You've earned yourself a break." Liam gave a small smile, rubbing his hands together to get rid of the dust. "No problem, Mr. Thompson. If you need anything else, just let me know." Mr. Thompson reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, holding it out to Liam. "For your trouble." Liam hesitated, then shook his head. "You don't have to pay me, Mr. Thompson. I'm just glad to help." Mr. Thompson pressed the money into Liam's hand anyway, his voice soft. "Take it. You've earned it." Liam looked at the bill for a moment, then nodded. "Thanks." Later that day, Liam walked to school. The weight of the morning felt heavy on his shoulders, and he found himself walking slower than usual. As he neared the school gates, he saw a group of kids standing around, their voices loud and mocking. "Hey, there's the limo kid!" one of them shouted, pointing at Liam. Liam frowned, his face flushing. He knew the kids, mostly boys from his class who liked to make fun of anyone who was different. One of them, a bigger boy named Kyle, stepped forward, a smirk on his face. "Where's your fancy ride today, huh?" Kyle taunted, stepping into Liam's path. Liam clenched his jaw, trying to push past, but Kyle blocked him again. "Come on, don't be shy. You got a limo, right?" Kyle said, his voice mocking. "Or was it just for show?" Liam looked down, his hands tightening into fists. He didn't have time for this, didn't have the energy to deal with them. He just wanted to get through the day. Another boy, Jason, stepped up beside Kyle, laughing. "Maybe he's too good for us now, huh? Got his mom working for rich folks, thinks he's special." Liam's face burned, but he didn't say anything. He knew better than to fight back. It wouldn't end well, and he'd end up in trouble. Instead, he pushed past them, his heart pounding as he walked quickly toward the school building. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Kyle called, but Liam ignored him, keeping his eyes forward. He could hear their laughter behind him, the sound echoing in his ears as he disappeared inside. School was a blur. Liam kept his head down, focusing on his work, not wanting to draw attention. He managed to get through most of the day without running into Kyle and his friends again, but their words stuck with him. He could still hear them, their voices taunting, reminding him of the limousine, of his mother's new job. When the final bell rang, Liam gathered his things quickly, trying to slip out of the classroom before anyone noticed. But as he stepped into the hallway, he saw Kyle leaning against the lockers, his eyes narrowing when he saw Liam. "Hey, Liam!" Kyle called, pushing off the lockers and walking towards him. Liam's heart sank. He tried to keep walking, but Kyle caught up to him, grabbing his shoulder. "Where you running off to?" Kyle sneered. "Got some big, rich plans today?" Liam shook his head, shrugging off Kyle's hand. "Just going home," he said quietly. Kyle laughed, shaking his head. "You're so weird, man. Acting like you're better than us just 'cause your mom works for some rich guy." "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Liam snapped, his patience finally breaking. He looked at Kyle, his eyes hard. "Just leave me alone." Kyle's eyes widened, then narrowed. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Or what? You gonna do something about it?" Liam stared at him, his heart pounding, his fists clenched. He wanted to do something. He wanted to make Kyle stop, make him understand that he wasn't trying to act better, that he was just trying to get by. But he knew it wouldn't help. He took a deep breath, then turned and walked away, his body tense, every muscle aching with the effort not to fight back. Kyle laughed behind him, but Liam didn't look back. He walked out of the school, his heart racing, his chest tight. He kept walking until he was far enough away that the sound of the school had faded, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves in the wind. When Liam finally got home, he was exhausted. He dropped his backpack on the floor, slumping onto the couch. The silence of the house wrapped around him, the emptiness pressing down on his chest. He closed his eyes, trying to push away the thoughts of Kyle, of the laughter, of the empty house. He thought of his mom, of her smile, of the way she hugged him before leaving in that limousine. He missed her. He missed the way things used to be, even if they were hard. At least they were together. Liam took a deep breath, pushing himself off the couch. He couldn't just sit here, wallowing in it. He had to keep moving, keep doing something. He grabbed a rag from the kitchen and started wiping down the counters, scrubbing at a stain that had been there for weeks. As he worked, he heard a knock at the door. He frowned, dropping the rag and walking over. He opened it to see Mrs. Holt standing there, her face worried. "Liam, dear," she said, her voice soft. "I was just wondering if everything's all right. I heard about your mother's new job and wanted to check on you." Liam forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, everything's fine, Mrs. Holt. Thanks for checking." She looked at him for a moment, her eyes kind. "If you ever need anything, you just let me know, all right? I know it must be hard, with your mom being away." Liam swallowed, nodding again. "I will, thanks." Mrs. Holt smiled, patting his arm gently. "You're a good boy, Liam. I'm sure your mother's very proud." "Thanks," Liam said, his voice tight. He watched as she turned and walked back down the street, then closed the door, the silence returning. He stood there for a moment, then went back to the kitchen. He picked up the rag again and started scrubbing, his hands moving automatically. He had to keep going, keep doing what needed to be done. It was the only way to make it through. Liam woke up to a house that still felt empty, even though it wasn't as silent today. The wind outside was picking up, and the windows rattled slightly in their frames. He pushed his blanket off and swung his legs over the side of his bed, taking a deep breath. He knew today was going to be another long day, and he could already feel the tiredness seeping into his bones. He walked into the kitchen, where his mother usually sat with her morning tea, but the table was empty. He poured himself a glass of water and took small sips. It wasn't much, but it helped wake him up. After washing his face, Liam set to work on the chores that needed to be done. The dishes had piled up, and there was a small tear in one of the curtains that needed stitching. He gathered everything in a bundle and sat on the floor, slowly mending the curtain while the sunlight filtered through the open window. Liam's morning passed slowly, each chore a small but heavy burden on his mind. By midday, the sun was high, and the air in the house had become hot and stuffy. He decided to step out to get some fresh air and maybe see Mr. Thompson, check if he needed any help again. He walked over to Mr. Thompson's house, knocking lightly on the old wooden door. The door opened, but instead of Mr. Thompson, it was his son, Martin, who answered. Martin looked at Liam, his expression shifting to one of recognition. "Liam, right?" Martin said, his voice neutral. Liam nodded, glancing past him into the house. "Yeah, is Mr. Thompson home?" Martin shook his head. "He's resting right now. Not feeling too well today." He paused, then added, "Can I help you with anything?" Liam hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I was just seeing if he needed anything." Martin studied Liam for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate you checking in on him. He's mentioned you a few times. It's good of you to look out for him." "Yeah," Liam said, looking at the ground. "Just wanted to help." Martin gave a small smile, though his eyes were a bit distant. "You're a good kid, Liam. If you ever need anything, you know where to find us." He hesitated before closing the door. "Take care of yourself, all right?" Liam nodded and turned away, his mind buzzing. He didn't know what else to say. He felt the weight of the day pressing down on him, the small errands, the empty house, the fact that even Mr. Thompson wasn't well enough to be out today. When Liam got home, the afternoon sun was spilling across the living room floor. He noticed his mother's apron hanging on the back of a chair, the fabric wrinkled. It must have slipped when she hurried out that morning. He walked over, picking it up, running his fingers across the fabric. It felt like a small reminder that she was still part of this place, even though she wasn't here as often as she used to be. He draped it over the chair, trying to make the kitchen look as normal as possible. He started to prepare something simple for lunch, just some bread and peanut butter. He was almost done when he heard the door creak open behind him. "Mom!" Liam called, his heart skipping a beat. It was his mother, her eyes tired, her shoulders slumping forward as she stepped in. She forced a smile when she saw him. "Hey, sweetheart. How's your day been?" Liam frowned, looking her over. She looked different today. Her hair was a little disheveled, and her face was flushed. He could see the exhaustion in the way she moved, each step heavy. "It's fine," Liam said, watching her carefully. "You okay?" She nodded, her eyes closing for a second as she rubbed her temples. "Yeah, just tired. Long day." "Do you need to rest?" Liam asked, taking a step towards her. His mother smiled weakly. "I'll be fine, sweetheart. I just need a few minutes." She moved to sit down at the table, her body sinking into the chair. Liam watched as she took slow, deep breaths. She looked so worn out, and it scared him. She never looked this tired before, not even when they were struggling with money. He grabbed a glass of water, placing it in front of her. "Here, drink this." She took the glass, her hand trembling slightly, and took a small sip. She looked up at him, her eyes softening. "Thank you, Liam. You're such a good boy." Liam didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. He felt helpless, watching her struggle, knowing there was nothing he could do to make things easier. "Are you going back tonight?" Liam asked quietly. His mother nodded slowly, her eyes closing again. "Yeah. Martin needs me to be there for a few more days, but I promise I'll come back whenever I can." Liam bit his lip, trying to hold back the frustration that was building inside him. "It's just, I don't like seeing you like this, Mom. You look so tired." She smiled, her eyes opening, and she reached out to touch his cheek. "I know, sweetheart. I'm doing this for us so we can have a better life. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Liam wanted to believe her, but the knot in his stomach wouldn't go away. He watched her for a moment longer, then nodded, stepping away. "You should rest for a bit before you have to go back," he said. She nodded, and Liam helped her up, guiding her to the small couch in the living room. She lay down, closing her eyes almost immediately. Liam stood there for a moment, watching her breathe, each rise and fall of her chest so slow, so labored. He turned away, the weight of it all pressing down on him again. After his mother had left again that evening, Liam found himself sitting on the front steps of the house, staring out at the empty street. He couldn't get the image of her out of his head, her tired face, the way she seemed smaller, weaker. It made his chest feel tight, like he couldn't breathe. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Mrs. Holt walking up the street, her shopping bag swinging at her side. She smiled when she saw him, stopping in front of the house. "Hey there, Liam," she said, her voice cheerful. "How's your mother doing?" Liam forced a smile, shrugging. "She's all right, just tired, I guess." Mrs. Holt frowned, her face softening. "I heard she's working over at that big place now. Must be a lot for her." "Yeah, it is," Liam said, looking down at his feet. Mrs. Holt reached out, patting his shoulder gently. "You're a good boy, Liam. You make sure you're taking care of yourself too, all right?" "I will, Mrs. Holt. Thanks," Liam said, his voice low. She gave him one last pat, then walked away, her footsteps fading into the distance. Liam sat there for a while longer, the sky growing darker as the sun dipped below the horizon. He felt the loneliness creep in again, wrapping around him like a thick blanket. He wanted to be strong, wanted to be able to handle everything on his own, but it was getting harder. The house was too empty, and the silence felt like it was swallowing him up. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes trying to hold on to the thought of his mother's smile, the way she promised that things would get better. He had to believe her. He had to keep going. Liam woke up with a heavy feeling in his chest. He lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quietness that filled the house. The only sound was the occasional creak of the walls or the soft rustle of wind outside. He felt the weight of the last few days bearing down on him. His mother's exhaustion, the school bullies, the sense of loneliness that seemed to never go away. He finally pushed himself out of bed, taking a deep breath. He went to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. The house felt even emptier today, like all the warmth had been sucked out of it. He tried not to let it bother him, but it did. Every step he took echoed, reminding him of how alone he was. After a quick breakfast, Liam grabbed his school bag and stepped out into the early morning light. The walk to school was quiet, just the sound of his sneakers scuffing the pavement. He kept his head down, his eyes on the road ahead. He wasn't looking forward to school, not after the way Kyle and his friends had treated him yesterday. The knot in his stomach twisted as he thought about it, about the laughter, the taunting. As he neared the school gate, he spotted them, Kyle and his gang already gathered, their voices loud and obnoxious. Liam kept his eyes down, hoping they wouldn't notice him, but as he walked past, he heard Kyle call out, "Hey, limo boy! Where's your fancy ride today?" Kyle shouted, his voice dripping with mockery. Liam clenched his jaw, ignoring him, but he could hear their laughter following him. He tried to walk faster, but Kyle stepped into his path, blocking him. "You ignoring me, huh?" Kyle sneered, his eyes narrowing. "Think you're better than us, don't you?" Liam looked up, meeting Kyle's gaze. His face flushed, his heart pounding in his chest. He was so tired of this, so tired of being pushed around, of feeling like he couldn't do anything about it. "Just leave me alone," Liam said, his voice tight, trying to push past him. Kyle shoved him back, his hand pushing against Liam's shoulder. "What's your problem, huh? You too good to talk to us?" Liam stumbled, catching himself. He could feel the anger building, his hands shaking as he clenched them into fists. He wanted to fight back, wanted to make Kyle understand that he wasn't trying to act better, that he was just trying to survive, just trying to get through each day. "What's the matter?" Kyle taunted, stepping closer. "You gonna cry?" Liam couldn't take it anymore. He snapped. He lunged at Kyle, shoving him back as hard as he could. Kyle stumbled, his eyes widening in surprise. For a split second there was silence. Then one of Kyle's friends grabbed Liam from behind, pulling him back. "Hey, what's going on here?" A teacher's voice suddenly cut through the chaos. Liam was yanked backward, his heart pounding, his breathing heavy. The teacher, Mrs. Daniels, came storming over, her face stern. She looked from Liam to Kyle, her eyes narrowing. "Both of you to the principal's office. Now," she said, her voice cold. Kyle glared at Liam, but he didn't say anything. Liam swallowed, the adrenaline fading, leaving him feeling hollow. He nodded, his shoulders slumping as he followed Mrs. Daniels inside. The walk to the office was quiet, the tension thick. Liam kept his head down, his mind buzzing. When they reached the office, Mrs. Daniels left them to wait outside while she spoke to the principal. Liam could hear the low murmur of their voices through the door, and he felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. This was it. He was in trouble now. After a few minutes, the principal's door opened, and Mrs. Daniels stepped out. She looked at Liam and Kyle, her expression hard. "You two are lucky I'm letting you off with just a warning. But if I catch either of you causing trouble again, there will be consequences. Do you understand?" she said, her voice sharp. Liam nodded, his eyes on the floor. He didn't look at Kyle, didn't say anything. He just wanted to leave, to get out of there as quickly as possible. When the school day finally ended, Liam walked home, his feet dragging. His head throbbed and he felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He had hoped things would get better, but they hadn't. It felt like everything was falling apart. His mother's job, the bullies at school, the empty house. He didn't know how much longer he could keep going like this. As he reached his front door, he paused, his hand resting on the doorknob. He thought about what he could do, what he should do. He needed to find a way to make things better, to help his mother, to take some of the weight off her shoulders. But how? He was just a kid. What could he do? Liam stepped inside, dropping his bag on the floor. He walked over to the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water. His eyes fell on the small stack of bills on the counter, his mother's handwriting scrawled across them. He knew they were struggling, knew that even with the new job, it wasn't enough. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit here and watch his mother work herself to exhaustion while he did nothing. He needed to find a way to help. He thought of Mr. Thompson, the old man's kind face, the way he'd offered to help if Liam ever needed anything. Maybe there was something he could do. Maybe Mr. Thompson had more work for him. It wasn't much, but it was something. Liam made up his mind. He was going to see Mr. Thompson. He needed to do something, anything, to feel like he was making a difference. It was late afternoon by the time Liam reached Mr. Thompson's house. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the yard. He walked up to the front door, his heart pounding, and knocked. After a moment, the door creaked open, and Mr. Thompson stood there, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw Liam. "Liam, what are you doing here, son?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice gentle. Liam swallowed, his hands shaking slightly. "I was wondering if you needed any help, anything at all. I could do the garden again or run errands for you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson looked at him for a long moment, his eyes softening. He nodded slowly, stepping aside. "Come on in, Liam, let's talk." Liam followed him inside, the familiar smell of the old house wrapping around him. They sat down in the small living room, Mr. Thompson settling into his chair with a sigh. "I appreciate you coming by, Liam," Mr. Thompson said, his voice kind. "I know things have been hard for you lately. Your mom's been working a lot, hasn't she?" Liam nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. "Yeah, she's so tired, and I want to help." Mr. Thompson was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. "I understand. It's not easy, is it? But you're a good boy, Liam. You've got a good heart." He paused, then smiled gently. "You know, I do have something you could help me with. The garden needs some work again, and I could use a hand around the house. I can't pay much, but I'd be happy to give you a little something for your time." Liam's heart lifted, a small glimmer of hope sparking in his chest. "Really? I'd be happy to help, Mr. Thompson. Anything you need." Mr. Thompson nodded, his smile widening. "All right then. We'll start tomorrow. I'll show you what needs to be done, and we'll take it from there." Liam nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a way to help, to make things just a little bit easier. Liam left Mr. Thompson's house as the sun was setting, the sky painted in soft oranges and pinks. He walked home, his steps a little lighter, the knot in his chest loosening just a bit. He knew things wouldn't change overnight, knew that there were still challenges ahead, but at least he had a plan now. At least he was doing something. When he got home, the house was still empty, but it didn't feel quite as heavy this time. He set his school bag on the couch, then walked to the kitchen, grabbing a rag and starting to wipe down the counters. He worked slowly, each movement deliberate, his mind clear for the first time in days. He thought about his mother, about the way her face had lit up when she talked about the new job. He thought about Mr. Thompson, the way the old man had looked at him with kindness. And he thought about tomorrow, about the garden, about the work that needed to be done, about the small steps he was taking to make things better. It wasn't a big change, but it was a start. And for now, That was enough. The next morning, Liam woke up early, the house still cloaked in darkness. He rolled out of bed, rubbing his eyes as he made his way to the kitchen. Today felt different. He had a purpose. He was going to Mr. Thompson's house to help out, and that thought gave him a reason to move with a bit more energy. He grabbed a quick breakfast, a piece of toast, and pulled on his sneakers, ready to start his day. As he stepped outside, the morning air was crisp, the sun just starting to peek over the rooftops, bathing everything in a soft, golden light. Liam took a deep breath, feeling a small but important sense of determination swell within him. He walked down the familiar street, the gravel crunching under his shoes, the early hour bringing a rare calm to the neighborhood. As he reached Mr. Thompson's house, he saw the old man already waiting on the porch, a cane in one hand and a tired smile on his face. "Morning, Liam," Mr. Thompson called, waving him over. "You're up bright and early, just like I used to be back in my younger days." "Morning, Mr. Thompson," Liam replied, smiling back. He jogged up the porch steps and stood beside the old man, glancing at the garden they'd worked on before. It needed some love again. Patches of weeds were already reclaiming the space they had cleared. "Got a lot of work ahead of us today," Mr. Thompson said, his voice low, but there was a twinkle in his eye that made Liam feel a little lighter. "But with your help, I think we can get this place looking good again." Liam nodded. "I'm ready. Just tell me what to do." Mr. Thompson led him down into the garden, pointing out the areas that needed the most attention. The weeds had grown quickly, and some of the bushes were already starting to look a bit wild again. Liam knelt down, pulling on a pair of old gardening gloves that Mr. Thompson had handed him. He dug into the dirt, his fingers working quickly as he pulled up the stubborn weeds. The sun rose higher as they worked, and the warmth began to seep into the earth. But it didn't bother Liam. He liked the feeling of being out here, working in the garden, the smell of soil in the air, the rhythm of the task. There was something peaceful about it, something that helped push away the worries that had been weighing him down. Mr. Thompson stayed close by, sitting in an old lawn chair, his cane resting beside him. He gave Liam instructions, his voice slow and patient, and Liam listened carefully, doing his best to get everything just right. He could feel the sweat starting to bead on his forehead, but it didn't matter. He was helping, and that was all that counted. "You're a natural at this, Liam," Mr. Thompson said after a while, his voice filled with warmth. "My wife used to love this garden. She'd be happy to see someone care for it the way you do." Liam looked up, meeting the old man's eyes. "I'm glad to help, Mr. Thompson," he said. "It's nice being here." Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes misty. "It's nice having you here, son. It gets lonely sometimes, you know. My son visits when he can, but it's not the same as having company every day." Liam understood that feeling all too well. The empty house, the silence. It could feel overwhelming. He knew what it was like to feel alone, and somehow that made being here feel even more important. They worked through the morning, slowly but surely bringing order back to the garden. Mr. Thompson handed Liam a small rake to collect the weeds and dead leaves, and as Liam gathered everything into a pile, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride in the work they were doing. The garden was looking better already, and it felt good to see something take shape under his hands. When the sun was high overhead, Mr. Thompson called a break. He shuffled back up to the porch, motioning for Liam to follow. He opened the screen door and gestured inside. "Come on in, Liam. Let's get you something to drink," Mr. Thompson said. Liam followed him inside, stepping into the dimly lit kitchen. The house smelled like old wood and a hint of something sweet, maybe the cookies Mrs. Thompson used to bake, still lingering. Mr. Thompson moved slowly to the fridge, pulling out a pitcher of lemonade and pouring 2 glasses. He handed one to Liam, who took it gratefully, the coldness of the glass a relief against his warm hands. They sat down at the small kitchen table, the air cool and quiet around them. Mr. Thompson took a sip, his eyes crinkling with a smile. "You're doing good work, Liam," he said. "I appreciate it. It's not easy for me to keep up with things these days, and you've made a real difference." Liam looked down at his glass, his cheeks flushing slightly. "I'm happy to help, really. It makes me feel like I'm doing something useful." Mr. Thompson nodded, his gaze soft. "You are, son. You're doing more than you know." They sat there for a while longer, sipping their lemonade, the quietness of the house wrapping around them. For the first time in a long time, Liam felt like things might be okay. Maybe not perfect, but better. He was helping. He was making a difference, and that was more than he had felt in a long time. After the break, they headed back outside, and Mr. Thompson showed Liam how to trim the hedges along the side of the garden. It took some time to get the hang of it, but Mr. Thompson was patient, guiding him through it, and after a few tries, Liam managed to do it without nicking the branches too much. As they worked, a few of the neighbors walked by, waving and calling out greetings to Mr. Thompson and Liam. It felt good, like they were part of something, like they belonged. Mrs. Holt even stopped for a moment, smiling as she watched Liam work. "Looking good, boys," she called. "You keep at it, Liam. That garden's going to be the best one on the block." Liam smiled, waving back. "Thanks, Mrs. Holt." By the time they finished, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the garden looked neat and tidy, the bushes trimmed, the weeds gone, the flowers standing tall. Mr. Thompson looked around, his face filled with pride. "You did a fine job, Liam. I'm proud of you," he said, patting Liam on the shoulder. Liam felt a warmth spread through his chest, a smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Mr. Thompson. It feels good to see it all done." Mr. Thompson nodded, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small envelope. He handed it to Liam, his eyes kind. "I want you to have this. It's not much, but you've earned it." Liam hesitated, then took the envelope, feeling the small weight of it in his hand. He opened it and found a few bills inside, enough to help out at home, to take some of the weight off his mother's shoulders. "Thank you," Liam said, his voice thick. He looked up at Mr. Thompson, his eyes bright. "This means a lot." Mr. Thompson smiled, his eyes soft. "You've earned it, son. And if you ever need anything at all, you just let me know, all right?" Liam nodded, his heart swelling. "I will. Thanks, Mr. Thompson." As Liam walked home that evening, the sun casting long shadows across the street, he felt lighter. The envelope was tucked safely in his pocket, and with each step he took, he felt like he was moving forward. Like things were starting to look up, even if just a little bit. When he got home, the house was still quiet, still empty, but it didn't feel quite so heavy. He set his bag down, then took out the envelope, placing it on the table where his mother would see it when she came home. He knew it wouldn't solve everything, but it was a start. It was something he could do to help, to make things just a little bit better. Liam walked to the window, looking out at the street as the last bit of sunlight faded away. He thought of Mr. Thompson, of the garden, of the work they had done. He thought of his mother, of the way her face lit up when she smiled, and he held on to that image. Things were still hard, still uncertain, but he was starting to see a way forward. And for now, that was enough. Liam woke up, feeling the stiffness in his arms and shoulders. The garden work from the day before had left his muscles sore, but it was a good kind of soreness. It reminded him that he'd done something worthwhile, something that made a difference, even if it was small. He stretched, feeling the pull in his muscles, and then got up. It was still early, his favorite time of day. The light was soft, the air still cool, and the world felt just a bit quieter, more peaceful. He walked into the kitchen, saw the envelope Mr. Thompson had given him still sitting on the table. His mother had not yet come home from work, which meant she had probably stayed over at Martin's again. Liam felt a pang of loneliness, but he pushed it aside. Today was a new day, and he had things to do. After a quick breakfast, Liam grabbed his school bag and headed out. The walk to school felt lighter today. There was a sense of purpose in his step that hadn't been there in a while. He passed by Mrs. Holt's place, waving at her as she stood on her porch, sipping her morning coffee. "Morning, Liam," she called. "Looking chipper today." "Morning, Mrs. Holt," he replied, giving her a smile. He kept walking, the smile lingering on his face. The sun was rising higher, the warmth starting to settle into the air, and it felt like maybe today would be a good day. But as he got closer to school, the knot in his stomach returned. He thought about Kyle and his friends, the way they had cornered him, the fight that had almost broken out. Liam took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let them get to him. Not today, not when things were finally starting to look up. As he walked through the school gate, he saw them, Kyle and his group, huddled near the bike rack, their laughter echoing across the yard. Liam kept his head down, focusing on the path ahead of him. He could feel their eyes on him as he walked past, but he didn't stop, didn't let himself react. "Hey, Liam," Kyle called out, his voice mocking. Liam paused for just a moment, then kept walking. He wasn't going to let Kyle pull him in today. He had too much at stake, too much to do, too much to be hopeful about. But Kyle wasn't one to be ignored. He stepped away from his friends, walking towards Liam, his steps quick and deliberate. "I'm talking to you, limo boy," Kyle said, stepping in front of Liam, blocking his path. Liam stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked up, meeting Kyle's gaze. The other boys were watching, smirking, waiting for something to happen. "What do you want, Kyle?" Liam said, his voice steady. Kyle grinned, but there was something mean in his eyes. "What's your deal, huh? Think you're better than us now just 'cause you got some fancy ride showing up at your house?" Liam clenched his jaw, trying to keep his voice calm. "I don't think I'm better than anyone, Kyle. Just let me get to class." Kyle stepped closer, his face inches from Liam's. "Or what? You gonna make me?" Liam's hands were shaking, but he stood his ground. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make Kyle back down without making things worse. He took a deep breath, then said quietly, "I'm not looking for trouble, Kyle. Just let me go." For a moment there was silence. Then one of Kyle's friends called out, "Leave him alone, Kyle. He's not worth it." Kyle glared at Liam, then huffed, stepping back. "Fine. Whatever. Just know I'm watching you, limo boy." He turned back to his friends, the group dissolving into laughter as they walked away. Liam stood there for a moment, his heart still pounding, his hands still trembling. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, then turned and walked to class. It wasn't much, but it was a small victory. He hadn't let Kyle push him around, hadn't let him ruin the day, and that was something. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, and by the time the final bell rang, Liam felt a small sense of relief. He gathered his things quickly, slipping out of the classroom before Kyle and his friends could corner him again. As he walked home, he thought about what had happened that morning, about the way he'd stood up to Kyle, even if it hadn't been perfect. It felt good, like maybe he was finding his own strength, even if it was just a little bit at a time. When he got home, the house was still empty, but there was something different today. The envelope from Mr. Thompson was gone, and in its place was a note from his mother. Liam picked it up, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Liam, thank you for this. I'm so proud of you. I used some of the money for groceries. I'll be home tonight and I'll make us something special. Love you, Mom." Liam felt a warmth spread through his chest, a smile tugging at his lips. He folded the note carefully, placing it on the counter. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a sign that things were getting better, that they were moving forward, even if it was slowly. With a renewed sense of purpose, Liam headed out again. He decided to check in on Mr. Thompson, see if there was anything else that needed doing. As he approached the house, he saw Mr. A. Thompson sitting on the porch, his cane resting beside him, a book in his hand. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," Liam called, waving as he walked up the steps. Mr. Thompson looked up, smiling when he saw Liam. "Well, hello there, young man. You're back already?" "Yeah, I thought I'd see if you needed anything else," Liam said, leaning against the railing. Mr. Thompson set his book down, his smile widening. "You know, I could use a little help with some things inside. If you're up for it." Liam nodded eagerly. "Of course, anything you need." Mr. Thompson led him inside, showing him a few things that needed doing, dusting shelves, organizing some old boxes, small things that Mr. Thompson couldn't manage on his own anymore. Liam set to work, moving carefully through the old house, the dust tickling his nose as he worked. As he dusted, Mr. Thompson talked, stories of his younger days, of his wife, of the garden they used to tend to together. Liam listened, nodding, smiling at the stories. There was something comforting about Mr. Thompson's voice, the way he spoke of the past with a mixture of sadness and fondness. It made Liam feel like he was part of something bigger, like he was helping keep those memories alive. After a while, they moved back out to the garden, Mr. Thompson settling into his lawn chair while Liam raked the leaves that had gathered along the edges of the yard. They worked quietly, the sound of the rake scraping against the earth filling the space between them. "You know, Liam," Mr. Thompson said after a while, his voice thoughtful, "you remind me a lot of myself when I was your age, always looking out for others, always trying to help." Liam paused, looking up at Mr. Thompson. "Really?" Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes softening. "Yes, really. You've got a good heart, son, and that's something the world needs more of." Liam felt his face flush, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Mr. Thompson. That means a lot." They worked until the sun began to dip below the horizon, the sky turning a soft orange and pink. When they finally finished, Mr. Thompson handed Liam a few more bills, his hand warm as it pressed into Liam's. "Take this, Liam. You've earned it," Mr. Thompson said. Liam looked down at the money, then up at Mr. Thompson. "You don't have to pay me, Mr. Thompson. I'm just happy to help." Mr. Thompson shook his head, his eyes kind. "I know, son, but I want to. You're doing good work, and you deserve it." Liam nodded, slipping the money into his pocket. "Thanks, Mr. Thompson." Mr. Thompson smiled, patting Liam on the shoulder. "Now go on home. Your mother will be waiting for you." Liam nodded, waving as he headed down the steps. He walked home with a lightness in his step, the evening air cool against his skin. When he reached his house, he could see the lights on, the faint sound of his mother's voice humming in the kitchen. He stepped inside, the warmth of the house wrapping around him, the smell of something cooking filling the air. His mother turned, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm making us some pasta. Hope you're hungry," she said, her smile bright. Liam nodded, his heart swelling. "Yeah, I'm starving." He set his bag down and walked over to the kitchen, wrapping his arms around his mother in a tight hug. She laughed, hugging him back. "You okay, Liam?" she asked, her voice gentle. Liam nodded, pulling back to look at her. "Yeah, I am. I think things are finally starting to get better." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." They sat down to dinner together, the house filled with warmth and light, the weight of the past few weeks starting to lift. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And for now, that was all they needed.